I spent 22 years in the United States Army. 2 tours in Iraq, 1 in Afghanistan. I've seen death up close. I've held dying men in my arms. I've walked through buildings that had been blown apart, through villages that no longer existed, through darkness that would make most people never sleep again. I do not scare easily. But I need you to understand something before I tell you this story. I need you to understand what kind of man I am, so that when I tell you what happened, when I tell you what I saw, what I heard, what spoke to me from the bottom of those stairs, you will understand that I am not exaggerating. I am not confused. I am not the kind of man who imagines things in the dark. My name is Derek Halford. I am 53 years old. And what happened to my family in the fall of 2017 in a house on Mill Creek Road in Harlan County, Kentucky, is the most terrifying thing I have ever experienced in my life. And I have experienced a lot. We moved to the property in late August. My wife Carol had inherited it from her uncle, Roy Sizemore, who died without children and without a will. The county tracked Carol down as next of kin. And just like that, we owned a house in the middle of nowhere, Kentucky. It was a 2-story farmhouse, built in the 1890s. It sat back off a gravel road, about a quarter mile into the tree line. Mill Creek ran behind it, 40 feet from the back porch. The nearest neighbor was 3 miles away. I wanted to use it as a hunting cabin. Carol wanted to sell it. We compromised. We'd spend the fall there, fix it up, assess what it would take to make it livable, and then decide. Our daughter Madison was 15. She wasn't happy about it, but she came along. The first night, nothing happened. The second night, Carol said she heard someone walking on the porch. I grabbed my flashlight and my sidearm and went outside. The porch boards were old and warped. They creaked when you walked on them. But when I stepped outside and swept the light around, there was nobody there. I checked the tree line. I walked the perimeter of the house. Nothing. I told Carol it was a raccoon. She said it didn't sound like a raccoon. It sounded like a person, walking slowly, back and forth. I said she'd been half asleep and her mind was playing tricks. She didn't argue, but she didn't agree either. On the 5th night, Madison came into our room at 2 a.m. She was pale and shaking. I thought she was sick. "Dad," she said, "there's someone standing in the yard." I was out of bed before she finished the sentence. I went to her window. Her room faced the back of the house, toward the creek. The moon was 3/4 full and the sky was clear, so there was decent light. I could see the yard, the old fence line, the darkness of the trees, the faint glint of the creek beyond. And then I saw it. There was a figure standing at the edge of the yard, right where the grass ended and the woods began. It was perfectly still, roughly human in shape, maybe 6 feet tall, but something was wrong with it. I stared at it for a long moment before I understood what was wrong. Then it hit me. It had no shadow. The moon was behind the house. Everything in that yard should have had a shadow stretching out in front of it. The fence posts did. The old oak tree did. But this figure, this tall, dark, perfectly still figure, had none. It stood there like it had been cut out of the night itself. I grabbed my rifle and came back to the window. It was gone. I went outside. I walked to the spot where it had been standing, right at the tree line. The ground near the creek bank was soft. There were no footprints, no broken branches, no sign that anything had been there at all. I told Madison it was a trick of the light. She looked at me the way 15-year-olds look at you when they know you're lying. I didn't sleep again at night. The next morning I drove into Kaywood.
and started asking questions about Roy Sizemore, the woman who ran the post office, a woman named Darlene Sturgill, who seemed to know everything about everyone in the county, told me that Roy had been what she called not quite right for the last decade of his life. After his wife Margaret died in 2003, Roy stopped coming to town, stopped going to church, stopped answering his phone. The few people who visited him said the house had changed. He'd covered all the mirrors, nailed the upstairs windows shut from the inside, and he'd scratched symbols into the wood above every single door frame in the house. Not words, symbols. Something like an elongated eye with a vertical line through it. When people asked him what the symbols meant, he said he was keeping something out. Darlene looked at me for a long moment before she answered my next question. Keeping what out? I asked. He called it the Watcher, she said. Roy said it came with the land. Said it had been there long before any of them. Before the house was built. Before the road was cut through. He said it stood at the edge of the woods at night and watched whoever was living on that property. I felt the hair rise on my arms. He said for years it was harmless. Darlene continued. Just watches, don't pay it any mind, he used to say. She paused. But the last couple years before he died, he stopped saying that. What did he say instead? She looked at me steadily. He said it was getting closer. When I got back to the house, I examined the door frames. I'd noticed the carvings before, but I'd assumed Roy had just been an eccentric old man with too much time and too little company. Now I looked carefully. They were consistent. Every door frame, interior and exterior, had the same symbol carved just above eye level. Some were old and dark with age. A few looked newer, like Roy had maintained them, kept them fresh, right up until the end. I found Carol in the kitchen and told her everything. Carol is the most practical woman I have ever known. She doesn't believe in anything she can't see and measure. She was quiet for a very long time. Then she said, I've been hearing it every night, Derek. The footsteps. On the porch. Why didn't you tell me? Because I thought I was losing my mind. And because I didn't want to scare Madison. We looked at each other across that kitchen, and I think we both knew in that moment that we should leave. Back the car. Drive south. And never come back. We didn't leave. I still ask myself why. Part of it was stubbornness. Part of it was practical. We'd sublet our apartment in Knoxville through December. But mostly, I think, it was because leaving felt like admitting something we weren't ready to admit. Whatever was out there, we told ourselves, had a rational explanation. We were wrong. By the middle of October, it had settled into a routine. A terrible routine. Every night, around 2 or 3 in the morning, Carol heard the footsteps. Slow and deliberate. Back and forth across the porch. Like something pacing. I set up a camera facing the porch. When I reviewed the footage each morning, the porch was always empty. But on the audio track you could hear it clearly. Slow, rhythmic footsteps. Creaking across the old boards. Something was making that sound. The camera just couldn't see it. Madison stopped going outside after dark. She slept with every light on. She told me she'd seen the figure 2 more times from her window. And each time it was closer to the house. I installed motion-activated floodlights around the entire perimeter. Powerful ones. The kind that can illuminate a football field. The first night after I installed them, every single light went off simultaneously at 2:17 in the morning. I was awake. I'd barely slept in 2 weeks. And I went immediately to Madison's window and looked out into the yard. The figure was there. It was closer than it had ever been. 30 feet from the back door. And now, in the ambient moonlight, I could see it clearly for the first time. It looked like a man. Tall. Thin. Dark clothing. But the proportions were wrong in a way that made my chest tighten. The arms were too long. The head was slightly too large. And it was facing the house. Facing, I realized, where the cold drop in my stomach. Exactly toward Madison's window. Not my window. Not the back door. Her window. I grabbed my raffle and went downstairs. I went out the back door. The yard was empty. I stood there in the dark, listening. The creek murmured. An owl called from somewhere deep in the woods. Everything was perfectly, absolutely ordinary. Except for one thing. When I walked back inside and looked at the frame above the back door, the symbol Roy had carved there was gone. The wood was completely smooth. Like it had never been carved at all. I checked every door in the house. Every single symbol. Every one of those carvings that Roy Sizemore had spent years maintaining was gone. Every door frame was clean, unmarked wood. I called my son Tyler in Knoxville the next morning and told him everything. He's a history student at University of Tennessee. He spent 2 days digging through county records and historical archives. What he found he emailed to me on the evening of October 19th. The land had a history going back to 1887, when a farmer named Caleb Morrow built the original structure. By 1889, he had abandoned it. The county record noted that Morrow had, and I'm quoting directly, quit the land citing ungodly disturbances of unknown nature. The next family, the Dunbars, moved in 1903 and lasted 4 years. A newspaper clipping from 1907 reported that Edna Dunbar had been committed to an asylum in Lexington, after what the paper called a prolonged nervous collapse. Her husband was quoted saying his wife had become convinced that something in the woods was, quote, studying the family, learning their habits, growing bolder each passing month. After the Dunbars, the property sat empty for 11 years. Then in 1918, a man named Harmon Sizemore, Roy's grandfather, bought it at a tax auction for almost nothing. His family stayed, built onto it, planted